Welcome to The Cognitive Edge. I'm your host, Dr. Miah Hammond-Errey. I'm the CEO of Strat Futures and an adjunct associate professor at Deakin University. In this podcast, we focus on anything that helps you think, learn, and understand to help you improve and gain a cognitive edge. Follow and join us on this journey. My guest today is Jessica Spendlove. Jessica is one of Australia's leading performance dietitians turned executive wellbeing coach, consultant, and speaker. Starting as a national swimmer herself, she has spent well over a decade working with professional athletes. That includes more than 25 seasons in professional sport, with clients spanning Olympic medalists, world record holders, NRL, AFL, rugby union, basketball, and netball teams. She advises major corporates and the ADF School of Special Operations. She hosts the Stay at the Top podcast and is about to release her first book this year, For the Long Run, Build Your Daily Operating System for Energy, Recovery and Wellbeing. Jess, thanks so much for joining me on The Cognitive Edge.
Thank you for having me, Miah. I'm looking forward to today's conversation.
I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Gadigal people. I pay my respects to elders past, present and acknowledge their continuing connection to land, sea and community. Jess, the health industry is rife with lots of disinformation, misinformation. What's the biggest myth you see high performers believing about cognitive performance and nutrition?
Goodness. There's a few. I think it can be really easy to kind of get caught up in the 30-second, 60-second reels that we're seeing, which is often the fasting protocols or the supplements. And, maybe we'll get to some of the supplements. And there's a space and a place potentially for that. But what we actually need to come back to is the foundations. What are the daily behaviors that we do every single day that are going to yield the biggest impact? And that's where I like to start. So it's nearly like the inverse of the pyramid that we're seeing in social media land, and then flipping that and going, every single human eats every day, we sleep every day, we breathe every day, we should be moving every day. Let's start there. That's where we're going to get the best bang for buck. And then when we want to layer in potential protocols on top of that, then we'll see if they are actually right for us.
What do you see as the difference between general well-being and peak performance, whether that's athletic or high-stakes decision-making?
Yeah, for me, I think it's hard to separate the two because I work at the intersection. And when you're, wired like that, I really do see the two. Whereas I think if I was to separate, general wellness is generally a bit more fluffy, and it's a bit not as precise and not as targeted. So everything I talk about is we do this for this purpose and this is how you should feel. And it's really connecting those dots on those three things, like not just the what, but the why. And most importantly, how that should show up. I'm a big believer in principles, but it's really looking at what are the drivers that are going to elevate our well-being, both today, tomorrow, and for the long run, hence the book. But what are also the principles that are either the same or intersect that then drive the performance outcome? And if I think about my own background, like technically I'm a clinical and a sports dietitian by qualifications, but even that, like you go through uni for 5 years, they really train you to be a clinical dietitian, which is very much around the well-being and working in the hospital and chronic disease side of things. And then that sports side of things, which for me I talk about as performance, is layered additionally on top of that. So yeah, I think the general well-being can just be like, eat more vegetables and eat more fiber. And yes, people should definitely be doing that. But the performance conversation to that is, the why, maybe around the microbiome and the protein conversation, which is huge for so many reasons. But it's not just, eat more protein. It's do this because it stabilizes your appetite, which stabilizes your energy because of your blood sugar levels, which also helps from a body composition lens. So it really is more targeted.
I've had the pleasure of hearing you speak, and that the stabilizing energy, the how and the why, and elevating well-being and performance really stick out. In your view, what are the foundational building blocks of good cognitive health, and what are those base layers that we need to put in first?
Yeah, it's obviously nutrition, like starting there, that's kind of where it all began for me. And, when it particularly comes to cognitive performance, brain health, but also, of course, physical performance, you know, what we fuel our body with is everything. It determines the substrate, what is available for our brain, for our body to then use that. And yes, that is the what, when we look at the types of nutrients. But a really overlooked piece of the puzzle, which I even start with before that, is what is the rhythm? What is your rhythm of your day look like? And if what you were doing from a nutrition, from an exercise, from a sleep point of view, if there is no rhythm or consistency there, then that is feeding into your brain, your cognitive performance, your physical performance. And so even before we start to look at the what, and we can definitely get into that, this is more, okay, well, can you just standardize the times that you eat and the size of the meals that you're having and the gaps between them? Because when I talk to people, and, I sit across a variety of industries as well, whether it's corporate or defense or elite sport, but there is a lot of chaos in behaviors because if we think specifically, the corporate world and hybrid work, well, when we all used to go to the office at the same time 5 days a week, that provided structure. But now we're often at home or in the office, and all of these kind of anchor points change. So I guess there's the what you're eating and then how you're eating. And a big part of that is also your hydration, because your brain, I love this stat, is close to 75% water. So when we think about that, of course, if you are hydrated or dehydrated, that is going to largely impact every element of your cognitive performance, from your focus to your attention to your your skills and your decision making. And it only needs to be off very, very slightly, like 1% for that to be impacted. Then of course, definitely sleep, very important, from what happens when we're in our deep restorative sleep. We now know that the glymphatic system is activated in our deep sleep, which is basically this brain waste clearing system, which comes and removes all the toxins that have built up for the day. So again, the consistency with sleep, probably the biggest, most important thing, and maybe the hardest for people, is the time they go to bed and the time they wake up.
I'd love for us to come back and just quickly touch on transitions, because I feel like sometimes we talk about these as ideals, and not every transition is as easy to get that rhythm back, and that maybe that should be a priority rather than worrying about, the exact amount of sleep, but understanding that we have transitions and we need to update our rhythms better.
I talk about this a lot in the book, and I specifically call these pillars that I'm going to touch on, the five, which are nutrition, sleep, exercise, stress and recovery, and connection. I call them rhythms in the book because it is about finding your rhythm with those areas in the season of life that you're in. Exercise was the next one I was going to touch on. And, there's so much there from, immediately around how we feel. Like, you definitely never regret a workout. But a lot of that even has to do with the biochemistry and the physiology of what our body is manufacturing after we exercise. Yes, the endorphins, but we now even know that there's these myokines and, BDNF and all of these really protective, amazing compounds, which are so great from a brain health and a cognitive performance side of things. Obviously looking at how we can manage our stress, and I'll put my hand up and I'll say this is probably for me the one I've struggled with the most. I think when you're driven and you're high performing, like, you can do it all until you can't. So the biggest interest piece for me in the recovery space, elite sport and the military understand, they protect, they know, like, high stress requires high focus, protected recovery. We don't seem to get that in the corporate world. And I know the session that you saw me speak on was largely nutrition, but with the keynotes that I do in the corporate world, I speak on, these five areas, and I always survey them before. And this is the one area where there is the biggest gap between what the elite athletes in the military are doing and what's happening in the corporate world. And some of it is the beliefs, it's still a luxury. Some of it is the mindset around, I don't have time. The last piece, which is generally around 10%, go, we actually value it, we try and protect it, but we're just struggling to figure out the how. And for me, the biggest benefit there from a cognitive performance and just an overall health perspective are what I call brain breaks. These are the daily micro moments of a minute or two or 5 minutes, or if you've got 10 minutes, but it's really about having intentional stimulant free time where you can down regulate, whether that's some breathwork strategies, whether that's a lap around the block. What it isn't is lining up for a coffee with your social media apps, checking because you're just stimulating yourself more. What it is removing all of those inputs and just having a moment to come down. And the very last one I'll touch on is the connection piece. And for me, that's kind of multi-layered. It's connection to your own purpose, which is your values, and are you operating like that? But also connection to people that matter, healthy relationships. And so for me, those 5 areas, and if I was sitting here and we were talking even like more physical health or physical performance, they would still be my 5 areas because, the mind body connection, you can't separate the two. What's going on in our mind impacts what's going on in our body, and vice versa.
Absolutely agree. One of the things that all our beta customers have found is that relationship between the physical and the cognitive. And I mean, of course, the human body is interconnected, but often we don't think of it in that way. And so many of our users talk about the fact that, minor changes in sleep timing have quite a big impact for them cognitively or, whatever it is. So I love the 5 pillars. Take us to the transitions.
I think, that's as well why my work has evolved because it was my own experience as an elite athlete, underfueled, not intentionally, but just not grasping what I needed as a swimmer, swimming 4 hours a day around school. And so unintentionally ran myself into the ground, worked with a sports dietitian, and then really felt that shift from underfueled to fueled. So that was the initial stage. But fast forward to 15 years into my career and, moving out of just elite sport and thinking, how can I take my work and help more people, coupled with my own burnout experience, which I briefly mentioned, coupled with becoming a new mum recently. Like, there's been a lot of things where this work has just evolved for me. And in the transitions piece, yeah, I really believe it's about meeting people where they're at in the current season of life. High performers are the classic, I'm referencing my best day and my best season ever, and that's my bare minimum. And
I'll set that bar forevermore. Yeah.
forevermore. And it's like, okay, you're talking about a 20-year-old when you were at uni and you had all this time or whatever that might be, and now you're like a 39-year-old mum with a 15-month-old who doesn't have the same 24 hours in the day, speaking of myself. Whatever your circumstance is, or whether you're navigating midlife, these transitions, these hormonal shifts, whether your career's shifting, whether you've got a really, high demand project, whatever that might be, it's coming back to these 5 pillars or rhythms and thinking, where are they at and what is the opportunity right now? And also, what can I do on my busiest day, not my best? And that needs to become the baseline. And sure, you can have your stretch days or your stretch goals, but when your stretch goal is your bare minimum, you're setting yourself up for failure. And so, yeah, I really live this work. I breathe this work. I've now put it into a book because this is what I see across anyone I would classify as a high performer, which are the types of people, you would be serving in all of your areas as well. And the one thing I'll say there, the reason I landed on the word rhythm, I've always exercised, and I'm a morning A type.
How on earth do you manage that with being a parent? Because that's the biggest loss I have being a
Well,
mum. I've had to learn to not work out at 5 a.m.
yes. Well, this is what I have now learnt as well, and I've had to make peace with because, and for quite a few months, I was in analysis paralysis. Like, if I couldn't work out, I basically didn't work out, and I was like, there has to be an in between. Like, what? How do I make this shift? Yes, 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. is my preferred time, when that doesn't happen, which is most days, well, what's plan B? Because plan A right now isn't serving me. So, it's looking at the days and I'm sure like yourself, you've got different days. Like I mentioned, we've got the at home, at work days. Like I know I've got different childcare days. So I've now just kind of figured out plan A, B, and C for the different days. And it's really this mindset of something is better than nothing. And the reason I exercise is for my mood because when I don't exercise, my goodness, like how I'm showing up at work, at home, I'm very snappy. I'm not handling the things, but yeah, I didn't get my 45 minutes in the gym at 5 a.m. that I want to be doing, but I got a 20-minute walk or a 20-minute at home workout, or I got something. And that finding this new rhythm with exercise, which has been a huge adjustment mentally and physically, has really helped with that. So yeah, that's how I've, been navigating this transition as well.
Yeah, it is huge, becoming a mum, I think, on many levels, and that was a big one for me. If someone wants to genuinely improve their overall cognitive function and performance, from each of the pillars, where do they start? What's the first thing they need to look at?
Yes. So, nutrition, I could obviously say so much, but let's start there. And I kind of already mentioned the looking at your day, like looking at the inputs of your day. What I typically see is the front end of the day, there's either nothing because someone's fasting and they think that's good, especially they've heard maybe from a cognitive side of things, or they don't like breakfast, or they're just having something really small. And then the byproduct of that is across the day, it generally gets bigger. And so what I'm talking about is a gradual increase. So what people need to understand, when their day looks like with their food, their energy will not be stable and their focus will not be stable, because your focus and your energy are outputs determined by your inputs. And so when your inputs, largely food, which largely drives blood sugar levels, which largely impacts both of those things, then it's going to be inconsistent. And in particular, in the afternoon and evening. So everybody will experience an afternoon dip, but when you start to then even out what your day looks like, even if what you're currently doing, if breakfast becomes bigger, if the time gap between breakfast and lunch matches lunch to dinner, or if one of those is quite big, so for example, lunch to dinner for most people is quite big, having a substantial mid-afternoon snack to bridge that time gap. So that's what I'm kind of talking about: size, timing, and also gaps, even if they start there. And then in terms of the composition, like, there's definitely a huge, huge piece here. And all I'll kind of say, mm, so we don't make the whole, I guess, episode about this, is I have a framework. I call it All the Elements. It's really about your 4 key elements on how to build a plate, which is your protein, your high fiber carbohydrates, your colors, so your fruits, salads, or vegetables, and then your healthy fats. And even at a starting point, if you have your protein, your colors, and your carbohydrates, if you have them in equal amounts, even if you start there, that is going to be a huge stabilizer when it comes to your cognitive performance. And what for most people that will mean is having more at breakfast than they're comfortable with, but taking a mindset of, I'm training myself to know how I need to eat. And like any other form of training, the more you do it, the easier it gets, or you just continue to adapt. And what you will find, if you can be persistent with that, you will see how that shows up in the afternoon. And I call that the flow on effect. Because what's generally happening, people are living very reactively. We wait for the gap in our diary. We wait for ourselves to get hungry. We wait until there's space to have a break, have a meal, whatever it is. And in all 5 of these areas, probably like the key takeaway is figuring out a way that you can switch from being reactive to proactive. Because when you do that, you don't just stabilize your energy, which you will, which is great, but you elevate it. So what I'm talking about is creating it, optimizing it, and then sustaining it. And this is a game changer. And it's not even, like, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of things we can go through. But what I'm talking about here is really just moving some things around and being a bit more intentional with the times and the sizes of what you're eating, just to start with in that area.
Diving a little bit further into the nutrition side of things, how can we fuel better when we're training? How do people understand what additional fuel they need for regular training, not necessarily peak performance? Because I think when we talk about regular consumption of energy, at some point, if you are training regularly, you really need to get that down pat. You can't continue to perform at that level if you're not actually fueling. But I know from my own personal experience, I don't think I fuel that differently on the days I do high intensity intervals versus the days I do heavy lifts. I probably have a little bit more carbs, but aside from that, what is the difference when we're doing different kinds of training?
Yeah, and great question. And diving a bit deeper. So that third is really that, like, start there as a starting point because, you know, most people are not doing that. Then I guess the next piece of that is you can start to adjust those plate ratios. And so again, this is like definitely included in the book. All of these like keynotes that I do, you would have seen my plate models and things that I like. But sticking with that, all the elements, then you start to adjust some of those ratios. But what a lot of people think is, oh, when I need more, I adjust all of them. And when I need less, I adjust all of them. And that's not the case. So your protein and your healthy fats, 7 days a week should really stay the same. So that third of your plate coming from protein, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, 7 days a week. And the reason for that is whether it's appetite control, whether it's recovery, because you are training most days, the elements that shift a little bit are really the carbs and the colors. And around that high intensity training, one way you can fuel, depending on the time that you train, is to just increase that carbohydrate component slightly. And so while I said a third, some people on here that are quite sedentary in their days, except for maybe that training session, well, maybe that carbohydrate component is more like a quarter on their standard day, but their high intensity day, whether they train around lunch, before or after, or in the evening or the morning, then maybe that increases to a third or a little bit more. Guys, the other option which can work for most people is that your 7 day a week meal framework really does stay about the same. That third of a plate protein, or for women, I would say around 30 grams of high biological value protein, which would mean that's coming from really the meat component. Maybe we can get into that, but because it is just the highest quality protein and it's so important in this perimenopause, menopause transition. And then, looking at the fiber component, which is, around, if you can, like 8 to 10 grams per meal. Like it's quite a lot. So you really do need quite a lot of veggies and quite a lot of grains. And so if you keep that all kind of quite stable, then it really is your fueling framework, which is really looking at, well, depending on the session, like if I've got, 45 or a 60-minute hit, maybe I just need to add in, it's something I call a primer. And it's it's carbohydrates in the kind of 15 to 30 minutes before a session, which is serving to fuel you. And you might also do a version of that before like a heavy weight session. And so without knowing the specifics, I would normally recommend around half a gram per kilogram of body weight. For most, you could just anywhere between, say, 20 to 40 grams is a nice kind of number in terms of that carbohydrate amount right before a session. So like a piece of fruit is one of the best options, even some dried fruit. And then, I know there's some conversation around, protein before and after. It really just depends on your overall distribution. Like if you're hitting your protein pulses, 3 meals and a really good snack a day, you're really ticking most of those boxes. So the question around, do I need additional protein before or after? Like if you can move a meal to work for all of those things, you're ticking a lot of boxes there. So it's really around that timing. But yeah, hopefully that kind of helps as at least a starting point. It's really that baseline framework. And then on the days you need more, you just add slightly more in around your training to fuel you and then also help you recover.
Thank you. That's great. You mentioned protein pulsing there, which is essentially, as I understand it, including protein in each of the meals to have a more stable energy and focus. How does it specifically affect brain function? Obviously, not just physical energy.
Yeah, for me, it's really stabilizing or elevating and stabilizing energy, and then the flow on effect in terms of appetite control and blood sugar levels. With that, it's not the only strategy. Like I would still want to be coupling that with, say, the brain breaks as such. But when you pulse your protein, I guess it's a more indirect relationship on how it will affect your energy and your focus. But we still want to be, because we only have so much cognitive capacity within our day, and it's really around how do we want to use it and how do we want to restore it and prolong it as much as possible. And so that nutrition piece is a huge bit, but this brain break concept I've mentioned a few times, for me that's really about aligning with a biological rhythm. And a lot of, again, some of the things I'm really interested in is our human biology has not changed in thousands or millions of years. What has changed is our environment and technology. So, if we can work with our biology, and there's a few ways to do that, sleep and your circadian rhythm is a huge one. But one of the other ones is it's ultradian rhythms, and it's this idea of these microcycles and how we've got peak performance pulses, but then we have these lulls, which is this restoration. And so the idea of having a few brain breaks a day to downregulate, to reduce your stress response, again, you could talk to this more than even me, but then operating in this biological way that we are wired to get the most out of it, have a short moment to reset, and then go again. And then from a cognitive performance side of things, we get so much more.
I do love where you're going because there is a difference between what we see so much in kind of the hyping community, which is about how you optimize. And don't get me wrong, I love optimization. Um, but there's a difference between optimizing and then having to operate at a really high level in not your best moment. And for a lot of the high stakes decision makers we work with, they don't have those luxuries. I mean, they're often operating in really physically difficult environments under high cognitive load where their sleep is not great or they have, very limited sleep, um, or stress for prolonged periods. And so it's amazing that in those environments, you still can get peak performance, but it is about adjusting other parts of that rhythm to make that work. And down regulation is a huge part of that. I'm going to hard pivot though. Let's go back to hydration. At what point of hydration does it degrade our performance? And what does it mean to hydrate better aside from drinking more water?
Yes, oh, there's a lot to say there. I think, starting at the top, I mentioned earlier, brain, if we think about our whole body, like our body is around 50% water, but our brain specifically is close to 75%. It's 73%. So if we even just think about us as beings, but then specifically when we're really kind of zoning in on this cognitive side of things, our hydration is a huge factor. I feel like we are in the era of, hydration drinks and what do we need to do? And like disclaimer, I'm affiliated with an Australian brand. So for me, with the types of people I work with, I do believe there is benefit, but it's not everybody has to have an electrolyte drink every single day. I think the conversation around particularly sodium, which is an electrolyte, it's the main electrolyte we sweat. So everyone sweats salt. Your sweat sodium concentration will differ person to person. But it's a really interesting conversation because how, I grew up and I'm sure the same. It was kind of like salt's bad and be careful of salt with blood pressure and this narrative. If you have high blood pressure, that is a factor. For me, outside of that though, if I think about the high performing, highly active community, where they're sweating a lot or they're exercising a lot, there's often a need to replace a little bit extra. And this is where electrolytes, again, in the right kind of format, can come in because when we actually, and there was a really interesting study done around rehydration and different drinks and looking at what is the best drink to optimally rehydrate. And rehydrate means not just consuming, but retaining. And this is a really important point because the sodium element in milk was found, the natural combination of milk, and this is how the whole like chalky milk post games or whatever, which a lot of people have probably heard of. Like that's how this came to be. Like there's actually a really robust, scientific study showing that that is the best rehydration formula because of the carbs and the protein and the electrolytes. And so if we extrapolate this out, the beautiful thing about good quality electrolyte products is that the sodium concentration helps replenish and also the magnesium and potassium because we do lose these as well. And they're really important from a lot of functions like nerves and muscles and contracting and functioning. But the main thing we lose is sodium. And so replacing that not only replaces what we've lost, but it helps us retain more fluid. And if we think from a cognitive side of things, and there's research in the sports space or the military, where there's skills and very, decision making, which is really skill dependent. And then also, corporate workers as such, where, there's focus and there's tasks across the board there's research showing that even as little as 1% drop in hydration can largely impact the fatigue or the focus or the decision making or the skill execution. And that's greater than the physical. So that it will impact the physical as well. If you're dehydrated, you fatigue faster because your heart rate has to pump harder. Um, and so I think, understanding that, having a bit of an awareness on your own hydration, and honestly, the easiest way to do that is the color of your urine. It gives you immediate feedback every time you go to the bathroom. Yes, if you take supplements that can tint the color post that next one, but what I'm talking about is monitoring it day to day each time you go to the bathroom. The ideal is like a pale yellow, and I'm sure when you wake up in the morning, it's probably much darker than that. And then across the day, depending on how you consume hydration, and it really is the rhythm of hydration as well, because your bladder can only actually retain so much. So if you're just not having anything, sculling a lot, you're going to be losing more. And so trying to consistently consume it across the day. And then, yes, if you're exercising more in and around that, which could be part of your fueling strategy and then your rehydration strategy. But for me, look, personally, and the types of people I work with are quite high performing like yourself. Um, from that cognitive side of things, from long work days, from hours at the computer, it's probably one of the most underutilized strategies. And so even the need for electrolytes aside, I find most people are looking for another option. They probably, they might not, they're trying to probably drink less coffee. And so even just from that like palatability side of things, it can be a useful tool. And I think the other really important thing to know is every single one of us loses half a liter to a liter across the night, just breathing and environments that we're in. And so most of us are waking dehydrated. Um, you know, Back in the pro sport days, I used to, super glamorous, get to measure all of the athletes' hydration, which, yes, is exactly as it sounds. They would urinate in a cup and I'd have a little, it's called a refractometer, and you would test their hydration. And the reason I bring this up is these people are paid to train. They know the importance of hydration. And, oh God, I couldn't even tell you a stat, but over 50% would be coming in dehydrated. And this is like we're monitoring them, we're testing them, we're giving them guidelines. And so the reason I call that out is, I can only imagine how that translates into all of us. And so this hydration piece of really even starting your day, whether it's a glass of water, whether it's a glass of electrolytes, depending on if you exercise in the morning, whatever that is, but really then thinking about that rhythm and monitoring it yourself and aiming for that pale yellow. If it's clear, you've probably consumed too much in a go, but if it's dark, you're dehydrated, and that's going to be impacting every aspect of your performance, but definitely your cognitive.
Is what are the most common foods or habits that you see executives and athletes consuming that are sabotaging their performance?
Look, I think a big one is most people underutilize snacks. They don't really see them for the value that they can bring. And so I guess sabotaging it either by trying to avoid them, or just thinking that they're really small, like it's an apple or it's a muesli bar or it's a yogurt. And it's coming back to that all the elements framework that actually applies, at least for most people, for one good snack. You might need more because you might have long days or really active or whatever, but for most people need one good snack. And it's often a lot bigger than what they think. So it's the yogurt with the apple, maybe with the nuts. Um, and the benefit of that is giving your body and your brain what it needs to satisfy you and boost your energy. But then likely it will maybe slightly decrease what you're having at night. And so if you come back to that, most people increase the volume of food across the day. If we're trying to then even it out a bit more, that pulse in the afternoon is a really important piece of that. So I think that's a huge one. Most people try to avoid them, don't think they should have them, or don't really see the value when it can really deliver a lot. And the other one is, a lot of people are dabbling with fasting for a few reasons. And my view is it's an advanced tool for an advanced user. And so I guess what I mean by that is you really need to have all of these other things in place first and then still assess, is this actually the right thing for me? And because what I then hear is people are trying to fast, but then they train in the morning and they try and fast by pushing their breakfast back, but they would actually benefit more from fueling and having that breakfast around to improve their results and then manage their appetite and their energy and their focus across the rest of the day. So there's this real like and it's coming from a great place, like, I hope that doesn't sound negative. I really understand people are doing this because they want, like, a positive outcome, whether that's the mental side of the cognitive clarity and performance, whether it's shifting some body composition, whether it's from a longevity, like, whatever it is, but there's nuance, and in most instances, most people would benefit more from the rhythm, the elements, a little bit of periodization with the fueling in and around, and that's actually gonna support the goals that they've got, whether it's the cognitive focus, whether it's the longevity, whether it's the body composition, that's actually gonna support that more. And because, as I kinda mentioned at the start, we hear things, we do them, but we don't run our own experiments, and so we quite easily forget how we felt before we adopted a new way of being, and so I really like, most people understand it from a business sense, like A/B testing. We talk about it from marketing or funnels or landing pages or whatever. Have an A/B test approach with your health. Change one thing over 2 weeks and measure all the data points that matter. Measure your focus, not just in the morning, but in the afternoon. What about your appetite? What about your energy? What about your sugar cravings? These are all little signs and signals on how you are operating as a being, but all of that is really gonna impact the cognitive performance side of things.
I think that's such an important point because I feel like so much of our nutrition and performance focus is based on body composition discussions. Like it's led by how do I look a certain way? How do I achieve a certain percent body fat or, a specific composition rather than how is this going to make me feel great? How am I going to perform well? How am I going to show up, and feel great, make great decisions, be a great human? And I think so much of that discussion is led by body composition. I think that's really disappointing and it underserves people because,
100%. For me, body composition is an objective metric. And I talk a lot on my podcast, in the book, with my clients about subjective metrics, the metrics that matter. And the three that I call out often are energy, appetite, and performance, both physical and cognitive. And when you lead with them, when you change behavior and you monitor those, which are always available to you, yes, some of those things you can track with wearables, but really the superpower is I always have access to how I feel, how my energy is, how my appetite is, how my cravings are. How did I train in that session? What was my focus like? Really, you've always got access to that. And so when you change behavior and follow those, the objective metric that you're chasing, which is the body composition element, will follow. And the thing is that objective metrics, they take time to shift. And, he won't mind me mention this because I've interviewed him on different keynotes and podcasts and things, but a client of mine, like these are elite athletes. Dane Rampy, Sydney Swans, this is in his 14th season. So we worked together only relatively recently. And I remember thinking, how much am I going to influence someone who's already, 12, 13 seasons under their belt? He's figured out what works for him. And this conversation around making decisions on these metrics that matter over the body composition, because in any sport and like you've just said, like drives conversation for everyone, but definitely in really high performing environments. And I was like, if we can just shift this, trust the process a little bit, like challenge some long held beliefs. And this is what I say to people: when you're changing, things are going to bounce around a bit, but if you stick to a process, focus on the metrics that matter, give yourself 6 or 12 months and then really do the due diligence on that testing. In his instance, he was like, I've never had better skin folds, which is body fat. I've never had more muscle. I've never had more energy. I've got a second wind. And so even just there with someone who was already doing 90% of the things right, who was seasoned, who had really figured out what worked for him, seeing the difference that made there, it kind of reaffirms everybody needs to know this.
I think one of the things you're hitting on, and we experience it too in the platform, people assume that when you are in a high stakes decision or you're an elite athlete, that you somehow expand your level of load and focus. And it's not true. And so it's always hard. Like you say, you've got to focus on those metrics that really matter, because it's just easy to get kind of swayed by what else is going on. I want to go a little bit to gut health and the brain, because obviously there's a lot of buzz about like the gut brain connection. What does the science actually show?
I think the biggest thing for people to know, and where my interest lies is, I mean, there's a lot, but the integrity of your gut wall. So we call this intestinal permeability. People might have heard it from the lens of leaky gut. But what we're actually talking about is the integrity of the gut wall. Like, this is how anything in our body either then enters like the system, goes into the bloodstream, circulates around the body, potentially crosses the blood brain barrier. Like, the gut is where things either exit, intentionally transfer, or if our system is weak, then anything can slip through. And so what we're really talking about here is strengthening the gut wall, and, looking at the fibers and the prebiotics and the probiotics. But it's not just what we eat, it is also non-dietary factors. Managing stress is a huge one. And again, this, the gut brain connection. What is going on in our mind impacts what is going on in our gut, and vice versa. Our gut also is a manufacturing facility. So a lot of neurotransmitters are manufactured in the gut. The vagus nerve, the biggest nerve in our body, is, this main connection and the way that our gut and our brain communicate. So we're just going to have this picture. What I like to talk about is they're kind of like best friends that are, communicating to each other on every platform, probably like you are with your best friends. You've probably got the WhatsApp, you've probably got the Instagram memes, like you've probably got some other form of community, the Facebook invites, so your gut and the brain are kind of doing the same thing, communicating in every way, shape, and form. But what we allow from our gut into the rest of our body needs to be a huge focus. And that is really around what we eat, how we manage our stress. It's also around disease. It's around toxins. Probably the biggest, and this is the one I do want to call out, ultra processed foods. And when people think of ultra processed foods, like, most people get most things that sit in that category. Like, we think about, the fried foods and the takeaway foods and all the things that we really understand. But one area is around how not all protein is created equally. There's this whole, we need more protein, we need a pulsar protein. I've literally sat here saying that. And a lot of people think, okay, well, I'll just get the shake, the ready-made shake, or I'll get the protein bar. And then if you actually look at the label on some of those, or most of those, it is sentences long, words you can't pronounce, numbers, and that is filled with fillers and artificial sweeteners, and they are some of the worst ultra processed foods. I'm really concerned that that is going to be something we're probably already starting to see it in different ways, shapes, and forms. But when we are consuming a lot of ultra processed foods, aside from some of the stats around chronic disease, the integrity of our gut wall, it compromises it. When they're called junctions, but it's basically, if you think about like a house with bricks, you obviously don't want any cracks in the cement. Few issues in the structure of your house. It's kind of like that with your gut, although the gut has the ability to tighten them and loosen them. And so by doing the meditation, by down regulating, by reducing your stress, by eating more fiber, by hydrating, by eating more prebiotics and probiotic rich foods, these things help strengthen the gut wall. And so that's probably the biggest thing I want people to understand, that yes, it is about what you eat, but it is also about how you manage your stress, and that overall piece of the puzzle. And yeah, with your gut, like, again, kind of like going to the bathroom, what I was talking about, monitoring it. Everyone has their own rhythm there. And that is the best indicator of how that's going. And the thing is, what I see is a lot of people in high pressure environments tolerating gut symptoms, which are an indicator. Like, they're an indicator of how you're operating. And when you are stressed, symptoms will flare up more because, again, the relationship and the vagus nerve. But if you have symptoms flaring up, just be curious with that, and consider this an area for you to dive into more, both from a what you should be consuming, more plants. 30 plants a week's a bit of a magic number from the American Gut Project. But then also thinking like your prebiotic and your probiotic rich foods, kefir, kimchi's, basically anything that has a fermentation process is really great. And then the stress side of things as well. What are you doing there? What practices do you have to help downregulate that? Because that helps tighten those junctions as well.
I've got a couple of questions on sleep and recovery before we wrap up, but I first wanted to touch on some supplements. Um, I know I kind of want to give you space to talk about supplements generally, but also specifically creatine. Obviously, creatine has kind of relatively recently ventured into the mainstream. What should listeners know about its role in brain energy and cognition, especially when under stress or in sleep deprivation?
Yeah, it's a really exciting time with the research in this space. I've just recorded an episode this week because I was like, it needs its own space, and there's a lot on the social media and everything. I think the main thing for people to know what it's showing is when we have higher levels of creatine in our system, and for women by default are a little bit lower or more susceptible in being lower than men for two reasons. One, we naturally consume 30 to 40% less on average, give or take the person, of creatine. And that has to do with our dietary intake. Men tend to eat more meat, and that is where creatine is naturally found in food. And so if you're plant-based, if you're vegetarian, if you're flexitarian, or again, we're just, you're mindful about your meat consumption, which there's benefits to that, don't get me wrong, but from this creatine conversation, it's just one of the reasons why your creatine stores in your body might be lower. And then on top of that, women have 20% lower synthesis. So we synthesize less. So there's a two-pronged conversation there. Um, but where I first became kind of aware of this conversation, even like a decade ago in professional sport and the military, we've been using creatine in the concussion protocols because when there's a concussion or a mild traumatic brain injury, creatine levels in the brain would drop. Where this is now evolved to in the mainstream is looking at creatine in different life stages for women. And what we're seeing is that we have different requirements across all of our life stages. And so this is actually probably about women needing more than what we think. And then coupled with those few things I just rattled off about us having less. And then there's some really cool studies which have come out around how higher levels of creatine, I will caveat that though in a second, higher levels of creatine can mitigate some of the symptoms with sleep deficiency. And so this is really around creatine stores in the body. 95% of it is in our muscle. There's about 5% in a few other organs, including the brain. And so what we're trying to do there is saturate our creatine stores, which takes a couple of weeks to do if you're taking, around 3 to 5 grams a day. And that just helps mitigate some of these symptoms that we're seeing. High demand, high stress, sleep deprived, carrying heavy mental load, basically where there's this, brain energy and cognitive requirements, either from a life stage or a situational perspective. Um, and there's only really a few indications. Like it's, I'm mindful when we talk about supplements, there needs to be a seek medical advice or, determine if it's right for you. But really, most instances where it really only needs to be considered is if there's a kidney disease, anything in that space there. It is a very well-researched supplement. You're starting at these lower levels. Probably the biggest issue when you start to have the higher levels, which being reported as beneficial for like the acute effects of sleep deficiency, is some of the gut symptoms that can come with it. So if you're not on a baseline level dose of 3 to 5 or even 10 grams a day, like 2 5-gram doses, I wouldn't go to like a 20-gram dose to, try and mitigate some of the sleep deficiency and the symptoms that go along with that, because that might help there, but from a gut perspective, it might be really uncomfortable. But yeah, for me, it's kind of definitely a tool in the toolkit. Like all the athletes, all the military, all of my high performing corporates, it's definitely something that is, I feel really, pro about from a cognitive side of things more so. And then there's the everything from the physical side of things as well. So there's really only upside.
Were there any other supplements you wanted to mention before I move on?
Probably the only other one is like your omega-3 fatty acids. So, and look, that's like a two-pronged thing. There's the inflammatory and the EPA side and the heart health side, and then the DHA, which is more from this brain health and cognitive side of things. And, it's really quite easy to get your omega-3 levels tested. It's called an omega-3 index to just see where you are sitting, because it's kind of like it's definitely one of the nutrients which, even if you're eating a lot of oily fish, it's very hard to meet the optimal requirements. And again, this is where we're talking about like, general recommendations versus optimal. And I think this is the positive side of things with the longevity conversation. We now have data around what is more optimal. And so that's probably the other high strength, high quality supplement that people should consider.
Thank you. I want to jump to sleep and recovery. For me personally, learning how to recover properly was just an absolute game changer. And whilst I was motivated throughout my life, having a child radically changed the equation for me because I just didn't have enough time to recover. I had to learn, like everyone else who probably learnt long before me, that you have to implement stress reduction protocols, genuine recovery. And for me, sleep has been a huge part of that. You emphasize the interplay between nutrition and sleep qualities. I know you've personally experienced burnout. What's the most practical dietary lever people can pull to improve their sleep? And then can you talk about how your experience reshaped how you think about recovery?
Yeah, definitely. I think again, to come back to the nutrition rhythm, like there's so many benefits to doing that, and the protein pulsing, because what that not only does is give your body more energy to operate across the day, but that also helps set you up for sleep success, because the closer to bed that we eat, the more that it can impact our time to get to sleep, our deep sleep, because energy and focus is going towards digestion rather than us, getting into that deep sleep more effectively, and then impacting that overall recovery. This bi-directional relationship between nutrition and sleep really is how the evolution of my work started, because again, like kind of like the gut and the brain, they're the best friends. They can positively influence each other. But for most of us, they're negatively down spiraling each other, because we're skewing our intake to later in the day. It's impacting our sleep. If we don't get good quality sleep, it disrupts our appetite hormones. We're then driven to want to eat more food. It's definitely not high fiber, high protein foods. And then that cycle kind of goes on. So that redistributing, focusing your meals, spreading it out more evenly across the day, and then the composition element, the protein, the fiber, the plate ratios, that will be a game changer for all of this.
For my audience who I may not have tracked why I put sleep and recovery together, sleep is one of the most profound recovery mechanisms for the body. And so those two naturally came to me together. You have already touched on some of the ways that you've used recovery, particularly brain breaks and so on. How have you built in a better rhythm in terms of recovery?
Yeah, I think, look, recovery for me was non-existent. And I feel like a hypocrite sitting here, because it was like I was working with, at one point, 7 professional sports teams at once. I'd built a business. I had a team of dietitians, but I was still like face to face with hundreds of elite athletes at one time, preaching recovery, and then thinking I was the exception to the rule. I see this in a lot of people. They think that they're invincible, and you are invincible until you aren't. And the only thing that's guaranteed is when you're operating at an unsustainable pace. It's not if, but when. Um, and so, yes, same. Learnt the hard way, despite knowing better. For me, it was like a story of, well, this is the price I pay for the opportunities I've been afforded. Like, I work 14-hour days and I work 7 days a week and I travel around the country, and I was fueled on adrenaline and cortisol and probably caffeine. And while I was ticking the boxes of I ate well and I slept well because I was exhausted, yeah, the recovery piece was non existent. There was no down regulating. There was no daily brain breaks. There was no weekly intentional recovery block, because in elite sport, you work on the weekend because of games. And so my days off, if I ever had them, and I hadn't filled it with another team that I was going to see, was a weekday. And so I'd just go to a cafe and work. Like, what else was I doing? There was no, and maybe sometimes it was at the beach, so it was a blend, but I was overstimulated. I have a corporate client at the moment, very senior, CEO type person. And he was quite offended by me saying, you know, we need to manage your stress. And he's like, I'm not stressed, I'm stimulated. And I'm like, whatever language we try to choose, but you work 7 days a week. You look at your screen. What I'm talking about is being on and having moments of stillness and moments to decompress. Because if you don't do that, it'll happen at night. And that's why you're waking at 2 or 3 a.m. And that's why you can't get back to sleep, or that's why you can't get to sleep. Yes. So, recovery and sleep do go together. But in the book, I've separated them because sleep is so important for so many reasons. It's really the bedrock. And for me, it's like if you're listening to all of these and like where to begin, sleep is where I would be recommending. And the time I go to bed some nights is so early, but it's just what I need to do to get that sleep sorted. Consistency, is the ideal, and getting a good or as good of a night's sleep as I can is the number one underpinning piece.
I love the way that you started this by saying good for your worst day, not your best day, because essentially you can't maintain a system that's trying to reach here when you're only here. And we all have those days. So much of this is about building the right systems in place in our lives. I also wanted to pick up on something that you just mentioned there. It is so important in a lot of our work, and that is language. The use of the term emotional self-regulation is often less easily acknowledged by some groups, particularly men, whereas things like down regulation or other terms which have a different connotation seem to be more easily managed, and that's part of the game. So thank you for raising that, because it is such an important point.
It's just interesting. It's finding that connection. I've learned with the different groups, and everything I talk about is very principle based, but how it gets applied, the nuance. It's why I survey groups as much as possible before I enter a room. So I just really understand where they're at, where I'm meeting them at. And while it's, I'm taking lessons from other areas which are well researched, it's not just doing this because the elite athletes or the military or whatever are doing it. It's taking the principle and applying it, and really always meeting the person or the group or the organization where they are at. And language is such a big piece of that.
Jess, thank you so much. To close out, something I ask every guest, what are your top 5 tips for anyone thinking about cognition and nutrition?
The rhythm, there's so much in the rhythm, the distribution of the day, the size of the meals and the gaps. We want to standardize that and spread that out as much as possible, so you're being proactive with your day, not reactive. The second is that composition. So, and in particular, if you want to focus on 2 specific components, I would say the protein, a third of the plate. For women, that's 30 grams of high biological value. For men, it's probably closer to 40. And then also the fiber. So 8 to 10 grams. Visually, you're looking at a third to half the plate of colors, and then the rest is kind of grains. And then to the value added point of the fueling around that for, your exercise levels. The third is to really take hydration seriously and, again, be proactive with it. Monitor what you're doing across the day. Water first and always, but there is a place and a space for electrolytes, whether that's because you're active and you eat relatively, well and whole foods and there's not a lot of salt in your diet, and or you're exercising a lot, and or you just don't drink enough and you want to have more and water's just not cutting it for you. The fourth is to supplement intentionally, not randomly, but layer it in, the foundations first. I've mentioned creatine, specifically a creatine monohydrate. Some of my favorite brands are Coles Perform, Pillar Performance, Body Science, or True Protein. These are Australian-owned, Australian-manufactured, and third-party batch tested, which means that guarantees nothing else is in the product or cross-contaminated. And then my fifth one is experiment, but do it intelligently and intentionally. The A/B testing. Change one thing, change it for 2 weeks, have your data points, tune into the subjective metrics that matter, and really make an assessment. Is this a good thing for me across my day and weeks, or is this just a short-term fix I think is good, but I'm actually eating a chocolate bar in the afternoon, which I was never doing before. My sleep is, struggling. So you really need to look at the full picture.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me on The Cognitive Edge.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Cognitive Edge. Please take a moment to click follow and join us on this journey.